What's going on, everyone? I'm just a typical, average American, here today to react and learn about why the UK economy is doing surprisingly well. As an American, I'll admit that I don't know anything about the UK economy. It's just not something we talk about here in America. You could say we're pretty obsessed with our own American economy and what's happening with our inflation and interest rates and all that great stuff. So today, I'm really curious to learn about how the UK economy is doing, really for the very first time. So with that being said, let's take a look.
For at least the past decade, the UK economy has been in a bit of a state. A
Really?
post-2008 slump in productivity growth was compounded by Brexit, then the pandemic, and then Liz Truss. And the
Oh my goodness. Okay, this is all, this is all really like new information to me. I'm sure if you're someone who's living in the UK, this is all like pretty well known, pretty obvious information, but for us Americans, like, I gotta be honest, we're quite out of the loop with this stuff. Maybe that's our own fault for, all the information is available out there, and like we could learn about it, but instead we really do focus on America and the American economy. So I am happy today to actually learn more about this. I didn't know the UK economy has been doing not that good. What, they said for the last 10 years or so?
was compounded by Brexit, then the pandemic, and then Liz Truss. And the UK's median household income has been basically stagnant since. In the inflation surge of the last few years, the UK has also fared remarkably poorly. It struggled with some of the highest inflation in the developed world,
Wow.
while simultaneously suffering with some of the lowest growth rates.
Wow. The inflation rate in the UK is worse than in the United States? Is that true? I really didn't know that the UK was struggling all that much, truthfully. I can't say that I'm on the pulse of what's happening, in the UK right now, but I don't know. I just never got the sense that the UK was like in dire straits or struggling. I guess it's all kind of relative, like the UK is still a first world country, where people can live like happy, successful lives. So in that sense, like people are going to always be succeeding in the UK on some level. But compared to like, I don't know, some of the other countries here, France, Germany, the United States, the UK has been quote unquote struggling more with like inflation and stuff. And I didn't know that.
Inflation in the developed world, while simultaneously suffering with some of the lowest growth rates. However, in the past couple of months, the UK economy has suddenly started outperforming expectations.
Oh.
Growth has been surprisingly strong.
Okay.
Inflation has fallen, and from a certain angle, the UK looks better placed than its European peers to cope with the escalating geopolitical turmoil.
Really? What's happened in the last few months to turn everything around for the UK? This is great news, but now I'm just it's like I'm catching up on 10 years of UK economic news in like 5 minutes, which is fine. But since this is all turning around so quickly for the UK, what caused that? What's going so well all of a sudden?
So in this video, we're going to look at why the UK economy has suddenly started doing surprisingly well.
Okay.
And whether this tiny mini boom can last.
Okay.
If you haven't already released new videos. So let's start with a quick recap of the UK's economic performance over the past few years.
Okay.
Because, well, it's pretty rubbish. Like
Rubbish. The perfect British word to describe this. It's rubbish. Oh, I never get to use that word. That's very satisfying.
Basically every other country, the UK was badly affected by the uptick in energy and food inflation that we saw in 2022 and 2023.
Sure.
Inflation was already on the rise in 2021 thanks to a spike in consumer demand post-pandemic, reaching 5.5% in the UK in January 2022.
Interesting. Like, I don't know. I'm trying to I'm no financial expert, believe me. But I'm trying to compare this to like the United States, and I don't know, inflation got pretty darn bad. Here in the United States, we had to raise interest rates substantially, really slow down our own economy, desperately trying to avoid a recession right now. I don't know. So this is the UK like is it really doing worse than the United States? Because this actually all sounds kind of familiar to me. Like, you know, we're having rising grocery prices. The cost of everything's going up, and inflation has been a big problem here as well. And so I don't know. I feel like I can actually relate to this, honestly.
But it accelerated to new heights in the months after Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Year-on-year inflation rose to a high of 11.1% in October 2022, hovering above 10% until April, and then
Whoa, wait, what? Inflation rose to above 10%? Yeah, I don't think the United States went that high, our inflation. Like to 10, is that what they're saying? Like to 10%? That is substantial, actually. That is a lot.
falling to 4% in January 2024. For context,
Okay.
this was higher than both the US, where inflation peaked at 9.1% in June 2022, and the Eurozone, where inflation peaked at 10.6% in October 2022.
That's what I thought. Inflation got pretty bad in the United States, but not that bad. But it seems like if you look at this chart, like the whole world was pretty bad. Like inflation just went up for everyone. The UK just the worst of all. I wonder why the UK specifically got affected more. I don't know if we're going to go into that much detail, but now it's come all the way down to 4% in the UK, which is pretty extraordinary. We've managed to sort of tame inflation here in the United States as well through a variety of means that our government has imposed on us to do that. So I guess the UK kind of had to do the same thing to bring inflation back down, but it's good. 10% down to 4%, that's good.
Comparisons to the UK's European peers are even more embarrassing. In Germany, for instance, inflation peaked to 8.8% in October 2022. In France, it peaked at 6.3% in February 2023.
Okay.
And in Spain, it peaked at 10.8% in July 2022.
Okay.
But by June 2023, it had fallen to 1.9%, below the ECB's target and well below the 8% yearly rate the UK was suffering with at the same time.
Okay.
Now, you might expect high inflation to at least mean high growth, because high inflation is often a symptom of strong domestic demand, which would mean high consumption and therefore at least a relatively high GDP.
Okay.
Unfortunately for the UK, that's not how things panned out.
Really? Again, I don't know, believe me, I don't know that much about finance and economics, but I didn't know that periods of super high inflation could actually create strong growth in that country. But regardless, it sounds like the UK had all the drawbacks of high inflation, high cost of living, high cost of goods. Every price is going up, but none of the benefits of the UK experiencing high GDP growth, high economic growth. So that's kind of unfortunate.
Despite the fact that the UK's GDP was already doing worse than most of the G7, with UK GDP per capita down about 1% in real terms since the pandemic, the UK continued to post weak growth throughout 2022 and 2023.
You know, I never, Americans, like myself, we don't view the UK as struggling financially, or the economy like doing worse than any other country out there. Every country is kind of struggling right now. I never pictured the UK like this, so this is actually kind of surprising to me. Again, maybe if you live in the UK, you are experiencing this, and you're like shouting at my shouting at your screen like, "You idiot! It's been terrible." It's like, well, from here in America, like we don't see it obviously, and we're kind of focused on ourselves. So I actually didn't know about this. But I'm now that I do, I'm kind of behind the curve here. But I'm glad to hear that things are getting a lot better.
After posting relatively strong growth in the first quarter of 2022, GDP basically stagnated for 7 consecutive quarters.
Wow.
From then until the end of 2023. At the end of 2023, the UK actually dipped into recession, defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth,
Right.
with GDP shrinking by 0.1% in the third quarter and 0.3% in the fourth quarter.
Wow, so the UK technically experienced a recession. Technically. 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, I think is the definition. That was like at the end of 2023. Okay. The UK had a mini little recession, actually.
However, in the past few months, things have suddenly started to look at least a little better.
Okay.
In the first quarter of 2024, the UK economy grew by 0.7% quarter on quarter, representing an annualized rate of nearly 3%, and the highest in the G7.
Wow.
In the second quarter, the UK economy again fared pretty well, growing by 0.6%, the
Wow.
second fastest in the G7, behind just the US.
Ah, good to hear some good stuff about the US too. That never hurts that never hurts me to hear that. So now, compared to a lot of the biggest countries in the world, the UK is growing and doing better than a lot of other countries comparatively, after doing worse compared to all the other countries. So I don't know. I guess it was a big decline and now a big rise. So again, I'm really curious to hear like what is causing this all of a sudden. They're saying this has only been happening like the last few months.
This was largely because the UK grew by an astonishing 0.4% in May alone,
Wow.
double what analysts were expecting.
Wow.
Now, it's important not to overstate all of this. In many ways, the UK is still just catching up with other developed economies,
Okay.
which have generally fared better post-pandemic. And the UK is still the second worst performer in the G7 when compared on this metric. Nonetheless, good economic headlines are rare in the UK, and most commentators and most of the UK public basically thought the UK economy was doomed.
Oh my god. Oh my god. I feel it's so strange from my point of view to hear about this. I'm sorry, but this is just not a point of view that we're hearing about or discussing here in the United States. I keep saying that, but it's only because I'm a little shocked and maybe a bit embarrassed that none of us seem to know what's going on in other parts of the world. The UK was really struggling. Kind of sad for me to hear. But yeah, again, I just wanted to reiterate like how sort of surprising that is to me, because on the very surface level, very, very surface level, like none of us Americans would really have known that or assumed that. I was just thinking like, the UK seems to be doing as good as ever, you know? Every country's kind of struggling a little bit right now with inflation and other stuff, but to hear that the UK was struggling like more than everyone else, that surprises me.
This is why the forecasts for the UK's economic performance in 2024 have improved markedly, with the analyst consensus rising from 0.4% at the start of this year to 0.9% in July.
Okay.
So what's going on here? Well, you dig into the data, and it looks like most of this has been driven by growth in the UK services industry, which has grown by about 2% in the past 6 months.
The UK services industry. That's the major driving factor behind the surging rebirth of the UK economy? The services industry? Like servers and waiters and like bus drivers? Like that kind of thing?
This speaks to a wider cause for optimism about the UK's economy. It's often forgotten by the media and politicians, but the UK actually has a pretty great services industry. The UK is the second largest exporter of services in the world, after only the US, accounting for about 7% of the global trend, and exports grew by a further 7% in 2023 alone.
Maybe I don't understand what they mean by the UK services industry. Because they're saying that the UK is the second biggest exporter of services. How do you export services? I'm not sure what that means. I wish they'd give some specific examples.
For context, when we talk about services, we're talking about things like insurance, banking, or education.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. I feel like they can hear me or something. Insurance, banking, not the most interesting stuff in the world, but very, very important. Insurance, banking, education? How do you export education and insurance? I don't know. That's not for me to even, I have no idea how this stuff works, but I understand enough of this to be like, okay, cool. I didn't know the UK was so good at this stuff. This is why the UK is having such a, powerful last 2 quarters and really, making a big comeback.
All things that British companies provide to the rest of the world.
Okay.
The UK does less well when it comes to exporting physical goods like cars or petrol, which were all badly affected by Brexit. But the services industry has held up remarkably well.
Yeah, okay. When I think of exporting, I think of I can only think of physical things like exporting tennis balls or, that's a bad example, but exporting oil or something. So when, exporting services, I never even think about that. Okay.
And the UK economy is increasingly service-oriented. The UK's focus on services bodes well for a couple of reasons. First, global demand for services, and especially the services that the UK specialises in, like law and accounting, has risen faster than demand for goods since at least 2008.
Oh, wow.
This is largely thanks to the fact that, as economies develop and professionalise, they start wanting more services and less goods. And
nice. So the UK is really in a strong position now. The UK specializes in services that the rest of the world is really demanding more and more right now. So that bodes really well for the future of the UK. Maybe you guys were struggling there for a year or 10, but now things are looking a lot better. That's great.
And this trend is expected to continue in the coming years. Second, services are far better insulated from escalating geopolitical competition than goods. This is because economies like the US, China, and the EU are now all fighting for manufacturing market share in an attempt to guarantee themselves a degree of industrial independence. This means that economies that rely more on manufacturing and exporting goods, like, say, Germany, where much of the economy revolves around exporting goods like cars and machinery, are now entering an increasingly competitive global market, dominated by subsidized industry in both America and China.
Well, it sounds like America's doing okay. That's what's important. We can just end this video right now. America's doing okay. All right, see you next time. But seriously, it sounds like the UK, it actually is a big advantage that the UK is focusing on exporting services rather than exporting physical goods, because that's a much more competitive industry. Whereas the UK has really found its niche and what it can be the best at, exporting and succeeding with all these services. I really never knew any of that.
Luckily for the UK, though, services trade will be less affected by geopolitical frictions and could even be helped if increasing geopolitical friction requires more litigation and insurance. Now, the slight downside to the UK's persistently strong services sector is that it's kept service inflation, which the Bank of England is particularly worried about, relatively high, coming in at
Okay.
5.7% in June.
Okay.
But while this might make interest rate cuts slightly less likely in the long term, overall inflation isn't at intolerable levels.
Oh, so that's another thing I was interested in. So the UK has had to raise interest rates as well. I don't know how many of you follow that stuff. I follow it here in the United States, how we have to raise interest rates and everything gets so annoyingly expensive, and taking out loans gets really crazy and expensive. And it's the same thing in the UK. It sounds like they're about to cut interest rates here in the United States for the first time in a long time, possibly next month. But I'm not sure what they're doing in the UK as far as that is concerned.
And the fact that wage growth is slowing suggests that the UK isn't at risk of the so-called wage price spiral that keeps central bankers up at night.
Okay.
Ultimately, this is all great news for Starmer, both because he gets to take credit for something he didn't really have any control over, and because strong growth is basically the only way he'll be able to afford any investment in public services without raising any of the taxes he's previously ruled out.
Right, this is great news for Starmer, the new UK Prime Minister. What a time to come into office, right? And suddenly you come in and the economy starts doing much, much better, and you basically get to say, hey, it was me. I arrived, and everything's great. And it's like, wait a minute. That was going to happen whether or not you were here, but I don't know. That's just how politics works, right?
If you want to keep learning, the best way is
Oh, okay. I think that's the end as well. So this was actually super interesting for me. Very informative. A little dense, like a lot of information, some finance, you know. I think I think I understood most of it. And it was actually really interesting to hear like about the UK economy, because that's truly something I've not ever heard about. So this was all really actually quite fun to learn about. So anyway, if you enjoyed this as well, feel free to give this video a like or leave a comment with your thoughts on how the UK economy is doing and how it's getting better, especially if you're in the UK and this is affecting you. That'd be really cool to hear about. And if you're interested in more videos like this, me reacting to the UK and UK culture, feel free to subscribe for more. And until then, thanks for watching, and see you next time.